There's exactly one bomb in the entire American arsenal built to do what needs doing against a mountain, and it just went to work again over Tehran. The GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, 30,000 pounds of hardened steel and explosive filling, dropped from the belly of a B-2 Spirit that flew a 36-hour round trip from a base in Missouri, straight into an underground Revolutionary Guard command bunker buried beneath Tehran's Jamaran district. That's not a hypothetical, that's a confirmed strike, reported by the Wall Street Journal and corroborated by outlets tracking this war in granular detail. And it's the second known combat use of America's most powerful conventional weapon inside this specific conflict alone. But here's the thing that actually matters more than the strike itself. This same bomb is now being talked about openly, by the president himself, as the weapon that's finally going to get pointed at the one Iranian facility that's survived every single round of this war untouched, a fortress buried under a mountain that even the people who built the GBU-57 aren't entirely sure it can crack. So let's actually break down what this weapon is, what it's already done, and what happens if it gets pointed at the target everyone's been bracing for. Start with what actually happened over Tehran, because the details of that strike tell you a lot about how precious and how carefully rationed this specific weapon has become, even in the middle of an active war. The mission wasn't a standalone bombing run, it was woven into a high-risk personnel recovery operation, an effort to rescue the crew of a downed F-15E Strike Eagle inside Iranian territory. According to the Wall Street Journal's reporting, American bombers dropped roughly 102,000-pound class bombs around the recovery zone, specifically to keep Iranian forces from converging on the rescue team while it worked. And in the middle of that narrow, dangerous window, B-2 stealth bombers broke off to strike a hardened underground IRGC compound with the GBU-57 itself. Think about what that actually required operationally: fusing real-time intelligence about a downed aircrew, long-range strategic aviation flying from the continental United States, and the ability to simultaneously execute a hardened target strike, all within the same mission. That's an extraordinary demonstration of reach and coordination, and it's exactly the kind of moment that shows you why the specific bomb keeps getting treated as the last word in America's conventional arsenal, rather than just another weapon on a target list. To understand why that matters, you have to go back to where the GBU-57 actually came from, because this isn't a weapon that got rushed into service for this specific war. It's the product of 15 years of deliberate, expensive engineering aimed at solving one very specific problem. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dan Kane, laid out the origin story himself at a Pentagon briefing, describing how American military planners realized they simply didn't have a weapon capable of reaching and killing a particular kind of target. Deeply buried, hardened facilities built specifically to survive anything in the existing arsenal. So they built one. Hundreds of test shots, repeated trials against extremely realistic mock targets, refinements to the steel casing, the explosive filling, the fuse mechanism that has to survive the shock of punching through solid rock without detonating prematurely, all of it working toward a single purpose: killing a target at a time and place of America's choosing. That effort culminated in June of 2025, when the phone finally rang and 7 B-2 Spirit bombers flew the weapon into combat for the first time, dropping 14 GBU-57s on Iran's Fordo and Natanz nuclear facilities during what the Pentagon named Operation Midnight Hammer, a strike that Defense Secretary Hegseth described afterward as having obliterated Iran's nuclear ambitions. The technical specifications behind this weapon explain exactly why it's treated with this much reverence. The bomb weighs approximately 30,000 pounds, roughly the same as a city bus, but compressed into a cylinder about 20 feet long and 2.5 feet thick. When it's released from a B-2 flying at its cruising ceiling near 50,000 feet, sophisticated guidance fins steer it toward the target while it accelerates past the speed of sound, delivering somewhere in the range of 800 to 900 megajoules of kinetic energy on impact, an amount of force comparable to a fully loaded Boeing 747 touching down at over 150 miles an hour, except concentrated into an area the width of a doorway. That kinetic violence is what lets the weapon punch through as much as 200 feet, or roughly 60 meters, of concrete and hard rock before its fuse, specifically engineered not to detonate prematurely under that much shock and pressure, finally triggers the explosive core buried inside. Only the B-2 can carry it, and each aircraft can only carry 2 at a time, which tells you immediately how limited and how deliberate every single deployment of this weapon actually has to be. Now let's talk about how this specific war, not the 12-day conflict back in 2025, but the current one that opened on February 28th of this year under the name Operation Epic Fury, has already leaned on this weapon multiple times, because the Jamaran strike wasn't even the first use inside this campaign. Reporting from the early days of Epic Fury describes American and Israeli forces striking Iran with a combination of rare heavy ordnance, 21,000-pound GBU-43 Moebi bombs, 30,000-pound GBU-57 MOP bunker busters, and 2,000-pound BLU-1009 JDAMs, all deployed from B-1B Lancers and B-2 stealth bombers against underground nuclear storage sites, data infrastructure, and banking facilities, including Bank Seppa. That opening salvo was also the strike that killed Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and injured his son Mojtaba, who has since taken over leadership of the country's war effort. Fordo itself, the same facility hit during the original Midnight Hammer strike back in 2025, reportedly took another GBU-57 hit during this renewed opening phase, a signal that even a facility already struck once with the deadliest weapon in the American arsenal wasn't considered fully neutralized and needed hitting again. That pattern, repeated use of the exact same bomb against some of the exact same categories of target, is worth sitting with for a second because it tells you something important about how this war has actually unfolded compared to how it was originally sold. Operation Midnight Hammer back in 2025 was framed at the time as a decisive, one-time blow. Hegseth's own word was obliterated, and yet here we are, months into a completely separate follow-on war, and the single most powerful conventional weapon America possesses has already been called back into service at least twice, once against underground nuclear infrastructure during the opening days of Epic Fury, and again against a hardened IRGC command bunker in Tehran during that rescue mission in April. That's not the profile of a target set that got permanently solved the first time around. That's the profile of a regime that kept building, kept hardening, and kept giving American planners new reasons to reach for the biggest hammer in the toolbox. And that brings us to the target everyone in this war has been watching most closely, the one place this weapon hasn't been used yet, despite months of increasingly direct threats from the president himself. It's called Pickax Mountain, an English rendering of its Persian name, Ku-e-Kolangazla, sitting in the Zagros mountain range in Isfahan province, just about a mile and a half south of the Natanz nuclear complex that was already hit once during Midnight Hammer and again during the opening days of Epic Fury. Iran has spent years excavating a deep underground facility into this specific mountain, and despite 2 separate rounds of American and Israeli strikes against nearly every other major nuclear-linked site in the country, Pickax Mountain has remained completely untouched. If anything, construction there appears to have accelerated in the aftermath of the original 2025 strikes, making it one of the only major underground nuclear facilities in Iran to emerge from that entire war still largely intact. What makes this site so different from everything else on the target list is exactly what makes it so dangerous as a symbol. Nobody actually knows for certain what's inside it. The United Nations' own nuclear watchdog has never been granted access to inspect the facility, which means every assessment of what Iran has actually placed inside that mountain is built on satellite imagery, intercepted signals, and informed speculation rather than direct verification. Trump himself has acknowledged this uncertainty publicly, telling reporters in the Oval Office that Iran may have moved centrifuges into the site, potentially to a depth that would challenge even the most powerful weapons in America's entire arsenal, before adding, almost dismissively, that it doesn't actually matter unless Iran also has access to the enriched uranium material itself. "We follow the material," he said. "That's where the action is." That's a genuinely revealing statement because it suggests the administration's actual targeting philosophy has shifted away from simply destroying every suspicious hole in the ground and towards something more surgical, tracking the actual nuclear material Iran possesses and denying it usable access, rather than assuming every strike against infrastructure automatically solves the underlying problem. And there's real documented uncertainty about whether the GBU-57 could even do the job if it did get the order to strike Pickax Mountain. Weapons experts have publicly questioned whether even a 30,000-pound penetrator capable of punching through 200 feet of rock can reach a facility that American intelligence believes has been excavated beneath hundreds of meters of solid granite, specifically engineered to sit below the effective range of exactly this kind of weapon. U.S. officials have reportedly discussed using 2 GBU-57s in succession against a single target, a kind of 1-2 punch where the first bomb clears a path and the second follows through the crater, to reach even deeper. But even that combined approach carries no guarantee against a facility built at the depth analysts believe Pickax Mountain reaches. That's an extraordinary admission buried inside all of this rhetoric. The single most powerful conventional weapon the United States has ever built, the product of 15 years of dedicated engineering specifically to solve the problem of deeply buried targets, might still not be enough for this particular mountain. There's also a technical analysis worth walking through here, because it shows exactly where a strike like this would actually have to be aimed to have any real effect. Independent non-proliferation researchers who've studied publicly available satellite imagery and comparable tunnel facility schematics from sites like Fordo and the Shahid Boroujerdi complex have pointed out that these kinds of hardened mountain facilities almost always share the same structural vulnerabilities. ventilation shafts that have to reach the surface somewhere, above-ground power supply lines feeding electricity into the underground complex, and the open tunnel entrances themselves. In both prior strikes on comparable Iranian facilities, American and Israeli forces specifically targeted those ventilation shafts because they represent a weak point that lets a penetrating weapon gain deeper internal access than a direct strike against solid rock ever could on its own. Recent satellite imagery from Pickax Mountain shows a pair of western tunnel entrances still sitting open, which means, at least in theory, the facility remains vulnerable to a precisely targeted strike against those specific access points, even if a single bomb dropped onto the mountain's surface might never punch deep enough to matter. All of this technical uncertainty hasn't stopped the political rhetoric from escalating steadily over the past few weeks. Trump has repeatedly told reporters the U.S. will be hitting that area very probably pretty soon, and there's not a thing they can do about it. Language he's used in multiple separate public appearances, each time adding a little more specificity about timing without ever actually pulling the trigger. He's acknowledged there's no hard evidence Iran is actively using the site for nuclear purposes right now, but maintained that Iran may have stored centrifuges there regardless. And there's reporting suggesting this rhetorical pattern might be deliberate strategy rather than simple bluster. Trump has reportedly told advisors in the past that he prefers to keep Iran confused about his actual intentions by making dramatic threats, some of which he genuinely intends to follow through on, and some of which exist purely to keep Tehran guessing. That makes it genuinely difficult to know, from the outside, whether the next major escalation in this war is a matter of days, or whether it's another calculated bluff designed to extract concessions without ever actually risking the aircraft and the weapon on a target that might not even work. But the intelligence picture keeps adding pressure toward an actual strike happening sooner rather than later. Israeli intelligence officials assessed in the third week of July that Iran may have moved some of its highly enriched uranium stockpile into the Pickax Mountain facility, a stockpile the International Atomic Energy Agency has previously estimated at somewhere around 441 kilograms enriched to nearly 60%, close enough to weapons grade that further enrichment could theoretically produce material for multiple nuclear weapons. Iran's top Joint Military Command responded to Trump's threats by warning it would target American and Allied interests directly if the U.S. followed through. And separately, CENTCOM confirmed it was in the middle of an 11th consecutive night of strikes across Iran even as this specific threat was being discussed publicly, hitting military operations centers, drone storage facilities, and logistics infrastructure in an ongoing effort to weaken Tehran's ability to project power. So the broader campaign keeps grinding forward on every other front, while this one specific target sits there, publicly threatened, technically uncertain, and strategically loaded with more symbolic and material weight than almost anything else left standing in Iran. Here's a detail that deserves real attention, because it shows just how expensive and how carefully managed this specific weapon actually is behind the scenes, even as it keeps getting used in combat. The U.S. Air Force recently awarded Boeing, the only qualified manufacturer of this 30,000-pound class weapon, a sole source contract worth more than $100 million, specifically to replenish the GBU-57 inventory that's been drawn down through this war's repeated use. Air Force officials warned in the contract justification that any delay in getting that production moving would directly affect operational readiness within the command responsible for the nation's long-range strike mission. And here's the detail that really puts the scale of this problem into perspective. Deliveries under that new contract aren't scheduled to begin until January of 2028. That's not a typo, that's the actual timeline, meaning every single GBU-57 used in this war right now on Fordo, on the Jamarin bunker, potentially soon on Pickax Mountain, is coming out of an inventory that can't meaningfully be replenished for close to 2 years. The Pentagon is already working on what comes after this weapon too, a program called the Next Generation Penetrator, currently in design and prototyping with a 2-year development contract awarded to a firm called Applied Research Associates, explicitly framed as the intended successor once the current GBU-57 stockpile runs its course. But that successor isn't expected to be ready until sometime in 2027 at the earliest, which means for the foreseeable future, every decision about whether to strike a target like Pickax Mountain is also, implicitly, a decision about how much of an irreplaceable multi-year lead time weapon America is willing to spend on a single facility that experts openly admit might survive the attempt anyway. That resource math connects directly to a much larger and much more politically uncomfortable conversation happening back in Washington right now. During a recent congressional hearing specifically focused on this war's mounting cost, both in dollars and in strategic risk, Defense Secretary Hegseth faced blunt, hostile questioning from senators frustrated by what they characterized as a lack of coherent long-term strategy. One senator's exchange with Hegseth became a genuine viral moment, telling him directly that he personally represented the failure at the center of this entire campaign. That kind of confrontation inside a formal congressional hearing tells you the political tolerance in Washington for open-ended, resource-intensive strikes against uncertain targets is thinning fast, right at the exact moment the administration is publicly floating the idea of committing more of its scarcest, most irreplaceable weapon to a target even its own officials aren't sure will actually work. And that irreplaceability problem doesn't exist in isolation either. It's part of a much bigger drawdown that's been documented across this entire war. Independent analysts have already flagged that the broader American precision-guided munitions stockpile has been drawn down by somewhere between a third and half of its total inventory since this conflict first began, with Patriot interceptors, THAAD interceptors, and long-range cruise missiles all facing similar multi-year replenishment timelines because the industrial base simply cannot surge production fast enough to keep pace with wartime consumption. The GBU-57 situation is really just the most extreme version of a problem playing out across nearly every category of advanced American munitions right now. Weapons that took years or decades to design and build getting expended in a matter of months, with no fast way to replace them at the exact moment military planners are being asked to consider committing even more of that same finite inventory to a target that might not even guarantee the result everyone's hoping for. It's worth pausing on how the GBU-57 actually compares to the other massive weapon that's been used alongside it in this war, because the distinction matters for understanding exactly what kind of damage each one is actually built to do. The GBU-43, better known as the Moab, or Massive Ordnance Air Blast, is actually heavier in total weight than some configurations discussed for penetrator-style weapons, but it's built around a completely different principle. A huge, general-purpose blast designed to devastate everything across a wide surface area, rather than punch through solid rock to reach something buried deep underneath. When American and Israeli forces used both weapons together during the opening days of Epic Fury, striking underground nuclear storage, data infrastructure, and banking facilities in the same operation, that combination tells you something important about how this campaign has actually been fought, not as a single silver bullet solving every problem, but as a layered approach where different weapons get matched to different kinds of targets depending on whether the goal is destroying something buried deep versus flattening something closer to the surface. The GBU-57 is reserved specifically for the hardest, most deeply protected problems, which is exactly why its use against the Jamaran bunker and its potential future use against Pickax Mountain carries so much more strategic weight than almost anything else in this war's target list. There's also a human dimension to all of this hardware discussion that's worth not losing sight of, because every one of these strikes, however precisely engineered, happens inside a war that's already cost real lives on the American side alone. 18 U.S. troops have died since this conflict began, with the military reporting nearly 100 service members injured over just a recent 2-week stretch, though officials note the vast majority have returned to duty. Every mission involving a B-2 flying a 36-hour round trip into contested airspace, coordinating with a personnel recovery operation for a downed aircrew, carries genuine risk for the air and ground crews involved. Risk that doesn't show up in a discussion of megajoules and penetration depth, but that sits underneath every single one of these missions, all the same. The pilots and support crews who flew that April mission over Tehran weren't just executing a strike against a bunker, they were simultaneously trying to bring fellow service members home safely, and that combination of hardened target strike and life-or-death rescue operation happening in the same narrow window is exactly the kind of complexity that gets lost when a story gets simplified, down to just another bomb dropping on another target. It's also worth being honest about what Iran has actually managed to preserve despite 2 separate rounds of American and Israeli strikes against its nuclear infrastructure, because that context is exactly why Pickax Mountain has become such a focal point in the first place. Non-proliferation researchers monitoring Iran's program have pointed out that the U.S. likely didn't destroy every single nuclear-related site during its 2026 bombing campaign, with credible estimates suggesting Iran maintained roughly 20 separate locations tied to its broader nuclear infrastructure before this latest round of fighting even started. There remain real, unresolved questions about how many centrifuges actually survived the strikes on Fordo and Natanz, and about whether components manufactured and stored elsewhere around the country could eventually let Iran reconstitute enrichment capability even if Pickax Mountain itself gets neutralized. That's the uncomfortable reality sitting underneath every triumphant claim of obliteration made after each individual strike. A regime that's determined to preserve its nuclear program has had years to disperse, harden, and hide the pieces of it across multiple sites, which means even America's deadliest conventional weapon, used as many times as it's already been used in this specific war, may only ever be addressing one piece of a much larger, more distributed problem. That distributed whack-a-mole quality to this entire campaign connects to a strategic concern that extends well past Iran itself, because every GBU-57 committed to this specific war is a weapon that becomes unavailable everywhere else in the world for years afterward, given that replenishment timeline stretching out to 2028. Defense planners have spent the past decade preparing specifically for scenarios involving hardened, deeply buried targets in completely different theaters, and the same weapon that's now been used twice against Iran, with a third and possibly even more resource-intensive use against Pickax Mountain still being publicly floated, is the exact same weapon class that would be called on if a comparable hardened target problem ever emerged somewhere like the Pacific. That's not a hypothetical concern. It's the specific reason the Pentagon's own contract justification explicitly warned that any delay in restoring GBU-57 inventory would directly affect operational readiness for the broader long-range strike mission. This command is responsible for a mission that was never meant to be exclusively about Iran in the first place. So let's actually think through what happens if the order does come down and American B-2s fly toward Pickax Mountain with GBU-57s loaded in their bomb bays. Based on everything we actually know from the public record, this wouldn't be a single clean strike the way Midnight Hammer was originally sold to the public back in 2025. Given the acknowledged uncertainty about the facility's actual depth beneath solid granite, and the fact that officials have already discussed using multiple penetrators in succession just to have a reasonable chance of reaching the target, any real operation against Pickax Mountain would likely need to combine several GBU-57s aimed specifically at those exposed western tunnel entrances, and whatever ventilation infrastructure analysts have been able to identify from satellite imagery, essentially trying to recreate the same ventilation shaft targeting approach that worked against comparable facilities like Fordo and Shahid Boroujerdi, rather than simply dropping a single bomb onto the mountain's peak and hoping for the best. That's a far more complex, far more resource-intensive operation than a single dramatic strike. And it's exactly the kind of mission that would draw down an already strained inventory in a way that has real consequences for America's ability to respond to threats in completely different parts of the world for years afterward. There's also a real possibility, and worth taking seriously given everything documented about Trump's own stated preference for strategic ambiguity, that the strike never actually happens at all, and that the entire public conversation around Pickax Mountain has functioned as a pressure campaign rather than a genuine operational plan. Threatening to hit a target that even your own weapons experts openly doubt you can fully destroy is, in a strange way, a lower risk way to apply pressure than actually attempting the strike and having it fail publicly or succeed only partially against a facility whose true depth and contents remain unconfirmed even now. If Tehran believes the threat is real enough, it can still shape Iranian behavior around the strait, around negotiations, around whatever comes next in this war's endless cycle of escalation and pause, without America ever having to risk its most valuable remaining penetrator against a target that might simply absorb the hit and keep functioning underneath all that granite anyway. That calculation, threat as leverage rather than threat as prelude to action, would also explain why Trump has been willing to say things publicly that a more cautious administration would keep classified, because the entire value of the statement depends on Iran hearing it and reacting to it in real time, not on it staying secret until the bombers are already in the air. There's one more thread worth pulling before wrapping this up, because it reframes how you should actually interpret every future headline about this weapon going forward. A bomb this rare, this expensive, and this slow to replace isn't really a battlefield weapon in the conventional sense anymore. It's closer to a strategic signal, something whose mere existence and occasional carefully chosen use is meant to communicate resolve as much as it's meant to destroy a specific target. That's exactly why the Jamaran strike got folded into a personnel recovery mission rather than launched as a standalone operation. And it's exactly why the Pickax Mountain threat has been floated publicly, repeatedly, weeks in advance, rather than executed quietly and announced only after the fact. Every time this specific weapon gets mentioned by name in a presidential statement, it's doing double duty, threatening Tehran directly while also reassuring a domestic audience, and a nervous Congress, that America still has an answer for whatever Iran tries to bury next. Whether that signal eventually gets backed up with an actual strike against the mountain, or whether it continues functioning purely as leverage, may end up mattering less for how this war concludes than the fact that the signal itself has already reshaped how carefully both sides are calculating their next move. That doesn't mean there's no path forward at all, though. If Israeli intelligence assessments about enriched uranium being moved into Pickax Mountain get corroborated by additional sources in the coming weeks, the pressure to act, rather than simply threaten, will climb sharply because leaving confirmed weapons. Grade material sitting untouched inside a facility everyone already suspects is exactly the kind of outcome no administration wants, attached to its name once this war eventually ends. But if that intelligence stays uncertain, exactly the kind of unconfirmed, Iran may have moved centrifuges their language that's characterized every public statement on this topic so far. There's a real chance this becomes the encounter that never quite happens, the threat that keeps getting renewed every few weeks, without ever actually converting into a mission, precisely because the cost of attempting it against a target that might not even yield to 200 feet of penetration, spread across an already strained and slow to replace stockpile, may simply outweigh the value of finding out for certain. Whatever direction this actually goes, it's worth remembering what's already been confirmed and documented, separate from all the speculation about what comes next. The GBU-57 has already been used at least twice in this specific war. Once during the opening days of epic fury against underground nuclear infrastructure, and again in April against a hardened IRGC command bunker beneath Tehran's Jamaran district, delivered in the middle of an active personnel recovery mission that itself required extraordinary coordination between long-range bombers, tactical strike aircraft, and special operations forces working to bring home a downed American aircrew. That's the deadliest conventional weapon in the American arsenal, already unleashed, already proven in combat during this exact conflict, sitting in a finite, difficult-to-replace stockpile that the Pentagon is racing to rebuild on a timeline stretching out to 2028, while the president keeps publicly, repeatedly promising that an even bigger use of that same weapon against an even harder target might be coming pretty soon. If this breakdown helped you understand exactly what's actually confirmed about this weapon versus what's still just threat and speculation, drop a comment with what you think happens next, whether Pickax Mountain actually gets hit with everything America's got left in that stockpile, or whether this stays exactly what it's been for the past several weeks. A carefully calculated threat designed to pressure Tehran without ever actually testing whether the weapon can reach that deep. Either outcome tells you something real about how this war's final, most technically uncertain chapter actually gets written, and it's worth watching closely regardless of which way it breaks. If you want the next update the moment there's real movement on this specific target, go ahead and subscribe so it reaches you. The second something changes, and if you know someone who's only heard the surface version of this story, someone who doesn't realize the GBU-57 has already been used twice in this war, or that the weapon everyone's talking about using next can't even be replenished for another 2 years, share this with them. Because understanding what this specific weapon actually is and isn't capable of is the only way to make sense of where this war's most dangerous open question actually goes from here. And it's exactly the kind of context that gets lost in a headline built around a single dramatic word like deadliest. Thanks for sticking with this one all the way through, and we'll see you in the next one, right after the next satellite photo of that mountain gets published.